Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition here of Point of View, and hopefully this hour we'll have a chance to talk with Julia Lambert Fogg, who is a professor at Cal Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks, California, and we'll talk about that in terms of immigration, because that would be a very appropriate topic, since we the other day talked with Tony Suarez about this decision coming down from the Supreme Court about DACA, and so we'll get into that if we can make connection to her. But I thought in the interim, let me talk about a couple of other issues. My commentary today is about the national anthem, and there are just a number of people that are starting to say maybe we should just do away with the national anthem at sporting events. The argument for it is, of course, we want to have people love the country, but the arguments against it are starting to mount in that you, first of all, have a number of individuals that want to use those for protests, which have nothing to do with the sporting event and everything to do with just being a great distraction. We also, even before we had the protest, had the odd kind of circumstances. If you've gone to certain sporting events, I'm thinking like hockey or soccer, where oftentimes the majority of the players are not from the United States. They're from other countries, and they try to be respectful, standing there waiting for that particular national anthem from the United States. And then on cases like hockey, sometimes then they have the Canadian anthem and all the rest, and they're not even from those countries. But even sometimes the players from America kind of shift their feet. They seem kind of bored. They're focused on the upcoming game. And as much as we think it is wonderful to have the national anthem played in various events, I am much more touched by when the national anthem is played at a government event or at a military event where everybody is saluting, everybody is appreciative of the country. And if the sporting events are going to be a place where people are just going to protest, maybe we should think about eliminating them. But what is so interesting is my commentary today talks about the fact that there are a number of people that are suggesting, well, maybe we just need to replace the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, with something else. And up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Tulsa Athletic, which is kind of a semi-pro, I guess, soccer team, if I understand it correctly, they said, we've really tried to develop a culture of inclusion and acceptance. Now, never mind that I think when Americans actually stand and sing the national anthem, that's a great opportunity for inclusion and acceptance. But their concern is that, again, we have too many individuals from places around the world. So let's play something that maybe emphasizes inclusion a great deal more. And so they decided they wanted to play at their home games up there in Tulsa Woody Guthrie's song, "This Land Is Your Land." Now, first of all, let's just put some of this in perspective. Guthrie has been and was a very strong supporter of communism. As a matter of fact, Woody Guthrie actually said he wrote this particular song because he was just frustrated by hearing the Irving Berlin song, "God Bless America," and especially the rendition sung by Kate Smith, played endlessly on the radio. So he really, in a sense, wrote this as a critical response. Now, it's also worth pointing out, as I will as we go through this, that some of these alternatives also don't emphasize a republic like America, but oftentimes emphasize communism. Woody Guthrie was quite a fan of communism, and so here there's a sense in which this land is your land. Maybe doesn't have the words of communism in it, but certainly the individual that wrote it had communism. And at a time when we seem to be tearing down statues and memorials because somebody holds to a view we don't agree with, you've got to think twice about that one. Another suggestion has come from the journalist Kevin Powell. He had a different suggestion for some of these sports teams. Replace the national anthem with John Lennon's Imagine. And by the way, Robert Knight, who's been on the program with us many times as well, picked up on that in his column yesterday. I should probably print that out and speak on this issue. But again, you might remember it because, it's a dream of a world where there's no countries and no religion, nothing to kill or die for. But again, the communist theme kind of shows up again there because Lenin himself described the lyrics as virtually the Communist Manifesto. So it's just a great illustration of some of the craziness that is happening right now as people are really working hard to try to either get rid of the national anthem or replace it with something else. And maybe the best thing, especially for some of these sporting events, which may or may not take place. I'm really having some doubts about this right now. Patrick Mahomes, you might remember him. He's now got the largest contract in the history of any sporting event. He's going to get paid, and I have no evidence that the NFL is going to even play this fall, but we'll see. So anyway, those are just a couple of ideas in mind, and that's my commentary today. So if you go to that, you'll find that. My commentary tomorrow, I might just give you a preview, is on right and left. And that comes from our friend Stephen Moore. He's an economics columnist, used to write for the Wall Street Journal, still writes for National Review. He had a column in the Washington Examiner and out on a number of other newspapers in which he talked about how this pandemic and this lockdown have really created some differences between right and left. He said, the right believes that stay-at-home orders and social distancing requirements are counterproductive and should be repealed safely and immediately. The left believes that those orders must stay in place, but should only apply to those on the right, not to liberal protesters. And there is beginning more and more evidence to suggest that some of this latest spike in the coronavirus or in COVID-19 has come from some of these protests. And so that is a good example. And I think illustrative of something we've talked about on this program about how many of these orders from these governors, from these mayors, from these county judges have been applied inconsistently. He has a couple of others. One of those, the right believes the best way to revive the economy is to incentivize a dormant workforce to get back on the job. The left believes the best way to revive the economy is to pay people more money not to work. Now, it's a little over the top there, but again, we've talked about how in some cases providing all of these generous benefits to unemployed people have become sort of a disincentive to return to work. And then his final one, he also says the right believes there are limits to how much government can spend and borrow. The left believes that trillions of dollars of added spending and debt are advisable and benign. This is one place where I say I kind of disagree with Stephen Moore because I wish there were people on either the right or the left or both on the right or left that would express some concern about government spending. I don't get the sense that President Trump or the Republicans seem that concerned. I certainly have never had the sense that the Democrats are that concerned, and there's going to be a financial price to pay. But anyway, that's just a kind of a look down the road. That's my commentary for tomorrow. And, of course, my commentary today is on the national anthem. And if you don't receive the commentaries, let me just give you a recommendation. What you could do is go to the website right now, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Viewpoints or this one on the national anthem. And then when you click on it, there's a place where you can then sign up to receive it. So that will be a great opportunity for you to receive that in your inbox every single day. And so if you haven't done that, certainly take the time to find that. We have a take action item, which about an hour from now, I'll spend some time talking about one bill, one subject. That is something we talked about the other day with one of our guests, and I think it makes a great deal of sense. But when we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the subject of immigration, finding Jesus at the border. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should we play the national anthem before every sporting event in America? We all know the arguments for doing so, but the arguments against are increasing. Even before the protests, we often had sports like hockey and soccer where a majority of the players were from countries other than the U.S. And even the players from America often seem bored and focused instead on the upcoming game. Even now, coaches and owners are considering what they might do if many of their players take a knee or refuse to come out of the locker room until the national anthem is finished. Do they ignore it? Do they find the players? In the midst of this discussion and debate has come another proposal to replace the Star-Spangled Banner with another song. Tulsa Athletics said that they have developed a culture of inclusion and acceptance. Never mind that all Americans can feel inclusion and acceptance by participating in the national anthem, but they decided that they will play Woody Guthrie's song, This Land Is Your Land, at their home games. Perhaps they are unaware that Guthrie had been a vocal supporter of communism. Apparently, Guthrie was aggravated by the Irving Berlin song, God Bless America, especially when the rendition by Kate Smith played endlessly on the radio. He wrote This Land Is Your Land as a critical response. Journalist Kevin Powell has a different suggestion for sports teams. Replace the national anthem with John Lennon's Imagine. After all, it dreams of a world with no countries and no religion and nothing to kill or die for. Once again, the communist theme shows up. Lenin himself described the lyrics as virtually the Communist Manifesto. As you can see from these few examples, the debate about the national anthem has gotten crazy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, once again, just as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we're going to focus on time and intention on the subject of immigration. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I thought this book would be just a great opportunity to talk about some New Testament principles that we find in the Gospels and in the New Testament in particular, because oftentimes when we have a conversation about immigration and we talk about a biblical view, there's my little booklet on a biblical view of immigration. A lot of those verses come from the Old Testament. First of all, we recognize that the Old Testament theocracy is a little different than the United States, so there are some exegetical issues there. And so that's one issue. But also, of course, it's been in the news. We had last week Tony Suarez on talking about the whole issue of the Supreme Court ruling on DACA, which was kind of a good example of the Supreme Court deciding not to decide on that. So it's in the news, but it also is something we need to kind of think about biblically. So this new book, Finding Jesus at the Border, Opening Our Hearts to the Stories of Our Immigrant Neighbors. It's published by Brassus Press, which is really just an imprint of Baker Publishing Group. And the author is Dr. Julia Fogg, who has her PhD from Emory University, is a professor of religion at California Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks, California. She specializes in the New Testament and joins us now by phone. So, Dr. Fogg, thank you very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation.
Again, I guess we misunderstood when we were going to have you on, so I appreciate your flexibility in joining us right now. But let's, if we can, talk about how you maybe have been teaching, certainly New Testament and the whole issue of first century Christianity and the rest in your classroom, and then wanted to take some of those teachings and apply it to immigration. So how did the book come about?
It's a great question. I grew up on the East Coast, and I'm teaching now in California. I've been at Cal Lutheran for about 17 years, and I was a Latin American lit major in college, undergrad, so I loved Latin American literature. I spoke Spanish. I traveled. I lived abroad for a while. So when I came to California, I thought, this is great. I'll be able to dive into Spanish-speaking communities and become a part of what people are doing out here. And it turns out, teaching at Cal Lutheran, I'm not myself Lutheran, but the Lutherans called me up one day, the bishop's office, and said, we hear that you are bilingual, and we are looking for someone to preach next weekend. And I said, well, okay, I've never done a Lutheran liturgy, and I've not actually preached in Spanish before or done the liturgy in Spanish, but heck, I'll try it. So that Sunday, I went to a small church in Pasadena, recovering church, church with a Spanish and an English speaking services. And I remained with them for, about once a month for the next 5 years. And that's how I got involved with an immigration or an immigrant community, actually 2 immigrant communities. The English language service was mostly for Scandinavian Lutherans of 3rd, 4th generation. And the Spanish Lutheran service was for Latin American immigrants of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation immigrants. So it was a really interesting place to be, and I learned a lot about the issues that Latin American immigrants are facing today.
And again, one of the ways I think sometimes we interface, I know a good number of my colleagues, for example, teach ESL classes and things of that nature. So that's another way, because most of us may not feel comfortable enough to speak Spanish in a church service, except my engineer right now has got his hand up. Of course, he's very good at that. So the bottom line is that we wanted to try to take some of these kind of biblical stories. Let's maybe get to one of those, Matthew chapter 2, and see how, in some respects, you saw some correlation between what you see in terms of, for example, the stories of Jesus and even some of the New Testament epistles and some of that. So one of your chapters was on this idea of fleeing without papers. And I would imagine that when we talk about the baby Jesus and Joseph and Mary fleeing to Egypt, you saw a correlation there. Tell us how so.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this chapter 2 was actually the first chapter probably written in the book, and it was written as a sermon. So this chapter comes out of a Christmas sermon that I gave, I can't remember, maybe 7-10 years ago now, at this congregation that I was talking about. And in the congregation, I knew that there were young people who had been brought across the border. Today we call them dreamers, or they can apply for DACA. I knew that they had been brought across the border by their moms or their dads, essentially a child in a parent's arms at a young age from 5 months to 6 years old or whatever that was. And so when I sat down to read the Christmas story from Matthew, I thought, oh my goodness, I knew that this was Jesus being, fleeing from Herod and in danger of this king, and that Jesus' kingship was rivaling Herod's kingship. And I knew that when Jesus, escaped to Egypt with his family, then he was called back out of Egypt, and that journey was replicating the Moses journey, right? The escape from Egypt, and that Matthew was telling the story of Jesus as a parallel story to Moses, and that it meant something powerful to the first century audience of Matthew's people, that Jesus really did embody their same journey and was being raised up as their leader, having followed in the footsteps of Moses. And when I looked out at the congregation as I was preparing the sermon, I thought, these children have also been carried across borders. They have been fleeing local tyrants in many cases in their communities. And gosh, I wonder, and then it sort of flipped. So that was the beginning parallel, and then I flipped it and thought, well, I wonder what it was like for Jesus in Egypt. You know, if he was 2 years old at the time of the edict, or maybe, 6 months to 4 years old, what would it be like for that child to grow up in Egypt, hearing Egyptian language spoken, hearing Hebrew spoken, hearing Aramaic spoken by his parents, and then maybe having hand-me-downs from his cousins in Egypt until maybe he was, 10, 12, 14 years old, and they went back up to Galilee. And so I started playing with the ideas of what is it like to grow up when your family has crossed the border.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into some other aspects of that. But since we were talking about the so-called dreamers in DACA, we had Tony Suarez on. He said something which I knew, but we really hadn't even thought about this, and this is kind of my political comment. And Dr. Fogg, you don't necessarily have to agree or disagree, but he reminded us that the last time we had immigration reform was in 1986. Ronald Reagan was the president. I thought about this because we have a millennial roundtable that we do where we have individuals from Gen Y, Gen Z, all of whom probably weren't even born back then. And that was, if you think about this, a third of a century. And still the fate of some of the dreamers or DACA is still in limbo. And so that's another application that we'll talk about later in terms of some of the political issues. But we come back, I want to move from just the story of Matthew chapter 2 to Mark 12, where Jesus takes on the scribes and the Pharisees and those kinds of things. That chapter is vantage points and borders, where we stand shapes how we see. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of this book, I've never really seen anybody kind of address some of the issues of immigration from kind of the New Testament vantage point. It is a book that has about almost 200 pages. It is published by, again, an imprint that comes from Baker. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore since it's been out for a while, but we also have a link on our website at pointofview.net, so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. So when we come back, let me also open up the phone, so perhaps you just want to sit back and listen, and that probably is a good idea since we want to listen from her research. But if you have a comment or a question, 1-800-351-1212 is the number to call. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a little bit more about this book, we have a link there so you can kind of read what is posted there on Amazon. Of course, you can go to Baker and find some more there as well. And we have all of that information about her and the book on our website, pointofview.net. And so we'll come back and focus a little bit more of attention on a couple of the other chapters in this book that look at the issue of immigration, the issue of asylum, the whole question of the border wall. We've just got a lot more to cover. We'll do our best in the last half hour to cover some of those issues. So let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about the subject of immigration and refugees and all sorts of issues related to that. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We are privileged to have with us Professor Julia Lambert Fogg, author of the book Finding Jesus at the Border, Opening Our Hearts to the Stories of Our Immigrant Neighbors. We have a link, I think, to the Facebook page for Brazos Press, and also a link to her Twitter feed and some other information, but all of it is there. And if you would like to get a copy of the book, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And I thought for just a minute, Dr. Fogg, we might focus on this whole idea of Matthew 12. But to get there, you tell a story about Angel and Angel's, the church he attends and some of that. So maybe in some respects we'll use the example to get us into the scriptures if we could. But tell us a little bit more about Angel and his church.
Sure. Angel was also a member of the congregation that I've described. So it's a dual immigrant congregation, meaning it was founded by Lutheran Scandinavians who actually came from Minnesota to Pasadena, right next to the Rose Bowl,
Mm-hmm.
and another group of people, the Latin American side as well. And so Angel worked on Sunday mornings. He was a gardener, continues to be, and he, because he worked so early on Sunday mornings, he would come to the 9 a.m. English service. Now, Angel didn't speak much English, and all the Scandinavian Lutherans were very eager, and they would sit in the front rows of the church service for the English service, and Angel would sit in the very back row, so he could kind of slip out when he needed to go to work. The Spanish service was later. He would have understood the Spanish and the sermon, et cetera, in the later service, but he felt committed to come to worship, even when he didn't understand the entire service.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the most wonderful things about Angel was he found a way to fit into the rhythm of the service. So he would bring the chalice and the bread forward to the altar at the time of collecting the gifts of the people. He would bring that forward to the altar. And even though he didn't take communion, because he had been raised that you don't take communion when you haven't been confirmed or taken your first communion, and he hadn't had the chance to do that growing up, he wouldn't take communion. He would ask for a blessing. So the way he participated in the body and blood of Christ in that sacrament was by bringing those two elements forward. And I should say this was a church that was on the margins. It was maybe we had 10, 15, 20 people left. And so there wasn't a standing pastor, a full-time pastor who was able to conduct adult confirmation classes and do the kind of work to bring Angel into the full body of communion. So that was one of the reasons that he hadn't yet been confirmed to take communion.
Sure. Well, let's see if we can go to Mark chapter 12 in particular, because here's where Jesus is, in some respects, critical of what was happening in the temple. I was thinking a parallel verse might be in James chapter 2, where it talks about not showing partiality in the church or privilege or things of that nature. But you move from Angel to Mark chapter 12. So talk about that, if you might.
Sure, and the James passage is so beautiful and so clear about how we should not show partiality to those who come into our congregation. One of the things I struggled with being, a once-a-month pastor or a once-a-month worship leader at this congregation was I could see the economic and educational and even racial differences, linguistic differences between the two groups of people who were worshiping there. Mm-hmm. And they tried to interact, but as you said, language can be a barrier. And what I was trying to get at in this chapter is what happens when you shift your perspective. So I was standing in the front of the church, and I could see where people were sitting. But other people in the church couldn't see where people were sitting. I knew the economic situation of Angel and of the other members. I knew the educational levels. I knew the documentary status. Angel didn't have citizenship papers. He didn't have a green card. He was undocumented. And so I was really trying to interrogate my own stand and understand how I could help the congregation understand what they were going through. So one way is to go the James direction, but another way is to do it narratively and to say, okay, when does Jesus change perspective and points of observation? And I was always fascinated by this Mark 12 passage where Jesus comes into Jerusalem 3 times during the Passover week. And he never stays the night in Jerusalem. It would have been packed Passover. He stays with his friends outside, and he walks in every day. So when he first gets to his friend's house with his disciples, he walks in the evening, looks around the temple, goes straight up to the top of the Temple Hill, the Temple Mount, which was kind of parallel in height with Herod's castle, Herod's palace, and then walks back to his friends to stay overnight in Bethany. And then the next day he walks in, curses the fig tree, goes up, overturns the tables in the first courtyard of the temple, and there were a number of courtyards, and each courtyard allowed a different category or social group of people in. So the first category was anybody, Gentiles and Jews, and that's where Jesus does his prophetic act of overturning the tables. Then he leaves and comes back the next day. And the next day, he doesn't stay in that first court. He goes into the second court, mm-hmm. which is the court of the women. And this is where the widow's mite comes in.
Right.
In that courtyard, all the Jews are hanging out and talking to each other and learning from each other, teaching, and people are making this big display of their economics when they add money to the temple treasury. What I also thought about was that Jesus doesn't go into the next courtyard, right? The next courtyard is the courtyard of the male Jews, and women are not allowed in there, right? So, I mean, the kind of critical part of me is like, well, of course, they put the treasury where the women and the men can access it, and then they keep the women out of the next part. They want to make sure they get money from everybody, and then the next part is left open to just the men to get away from the kids and the women and to get closer to God. And I thought, Jesus used his did not use his privilege as a male to go into the closer courtyard to the Holy of Holies where God's throne was. He stayed in a courtyard where everybody had access.
Right.
That is, everybody among his people. And he didn't call out, this is the way we usually preach the story, is that the one who gives everything she had is more blessed than the ones who give a big dollar donation but haven't yet scratched the surface of who they are and what they have to give God. And it struck me that is part of the story. But the other part is that Jesus chooses to stay where he can see this one who gives everything she has, and make sure that the disciples see it too.
Right. And again, it's kind of like, in case you miss this, I want you to see this, because this, from the world's point of view, is very insignificant. Whenever I take tours over to Israel, one of the things they always want to get is a widow's mite, and you can get those pretty simple, and you realize how small they were and how, from a worldly point of view, it's insignificant. But there, Jesus is using this to say, you might miss the most important thing, because here it is right now. And again, he was in the place where everybody could travel through there. So let's take a break, because when I come back, I might jump ahead if you don't mind, since we won't be able to cover all of the book. But chapter 6 deals with the asylum, and that gets us into the issue of humility because you have, Philippians 2, which is what's known as the kenosis passage. So I thought that might parallel with some of the things you just said. So let me take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation today with Dr. Julia Lambert Fogg. The book is entitled Finding Jesus at the Border, Opening Our Hearts to the Stories of Our Immigrant Neighbors. And again, it is published by Brazos Press, which is kind of an imprint of Baker Publishing House. And if you would like to know a little bit more, we, of course, have information about the book and about her on the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, maybe we'll get into this idea of the detention centers, the issue of asylum, and a couple of other topics that we'll try to get into quickly. All that coming up right after these messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Gail Blair was a nurse at Johns Hopkins, but she walked away from nursing in 1989 and toward an unexpected encounter with the police. A degenerative condition that causes gradual vision loss drove Gail away from nursing. At just 37 years of age, she could no longer see. She and her husband moved to a place just about a block away from Wilcox Park and Westerly Public Library. She learned how to independently navigate the sidewalks that led to and from her home and sit in the park. As passersby strolled past in this 10-acre park, Gail would engage them in conversation, telling them about Jesus and sharing with them a copy of the Gospel of John. In 2019, park authorities accused this 63-year-old blind woman of accosting parkgoers and blamed her for littering when they found copies of the Gospel of John on the ground. They asked the police to ban her from the park under threat of arrest if she were to trespass in the future. Sighted persons are free to cross into the park and have conversations with anyone, but park officials called the police on a blind woman who shared her faith with others. First Liberty and its network attorneys filed a charge of discrimination with the Rhode Island Commission on Human Rights because banning a blind woman from entering a public park simply because she offers people she meets religious material is outrageous and discriminatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Having a conversation today with Professor Julia Lambert Fogg, who is the author of the book Finding Jesus at the Border, Opening Our Hearts to the Stories of Our Immigrant Neighbors. Lots of chapters in this book, and of course we won't have time to cover all of those, but encourage you to find out a little bit more. 8 chapters. I thought we might look at chapter 6 for just a minute for a couple of reasons. Number one, it gets us into this idea of how Christ humbled himself when he came to earth, which is part of Philippians 2. You've also been to a detention center. We've had a number of guests over the years, Dr. Fogg, who have been to some of like the detention centers in Texas, which is where we broadcast from, but you've been to at least one in California. So I thought I might have you tell the story and again how that relates to this idea of humility and suffering with those who suffer. Can you tell us more?
Sure. I wrote my dissertation on Philippians, so I spent a lot of time with this letter. And as a woman, women are often told, to exercise the humility of Christ, and sometimes that means not standing up for ourselves in a relationship or in our work or in a number of ways. So I've struggled with that, wanting to say that Christian humility is for all of us, not just the Christians we want to be submissive to others, but everyone should exercise it. And so I've always been trying to understand what Paul was saying about this humility a little more deeply. And going to the detention center and witnessing, face-to-face meeting with people who came to our borders and sought asylum, which is everyone's legal right to do. Our government is set up so that that anyone in the world can come to our borders and present themselves and ask for asylum, and then answer questions on immediate threat of life and these sorts of things, and then be adjudicated. But we house these folks in detention centers that are built like prisons, and that, at least probably in Texas as well, but at least this detention center in California is run by the GEO Group, which is a for-profit company. So the more people they have there that are detained, the more money they make. And the less food they give them, the more money they make. And so getting those detainees enough food and enough medical care and the right translators to know that they are being housed fairly, those who have come seeking asylum haven't broken any laws. So if we're going to take them into custody in a detention center, we need to care for them.
Yes.
So when I went to the detention center and met with folks, I was struck by how excruciating their psychological condition felt to me, and how much more excruciating it must be for them.
Mm-hmm.
So, one young man who was in a juvenile detention turned 18, and they moved him into an adult detention, and now he's 18, surrounded by 30 to 70-year-olds, and kind of at a loss for how to direct himself. And another man from Africa, and easy to communicate with him, but he spoke Twi and had lost all contact with his family. He was a Christian. His father was trying to kill him because his father was a traditionalist, a different religion, and was the head of that religion, and
so sad.
Wanted that man to take over that religion. And the man said, "I'm a Christian. I can't do that." So his father put out a death warrant against him, and he made his way all the way to Brazil, which is where a lot of people come from, all the way up the Americas to our border to present himself for asylum. And I started to hear these parallels between what these men were experiencing. The men are in one unit and the women in a different unit. It parallel to what Paul experienced and what Paul describes as suffering, being chained to a guard, not having enough food. In the first century, if you were imprisoned like Paul was and chained to a guard, you had to get your own food. So you had to have people in the neighborhood who would come and feed you, would supply you with writing materials and other things. And that's what a lot of the communities outside of detention centers are doing to support those in detention. Putting money on cards that they can spend at their internal commissary to buy extra food to supplement what they're being given in the cafeterias, sending writing utensils, letters, paper, and those sorts of things.
Sure. And you have a whole section here that you could not send any packages directly to the detention center, but you could send them through Amazon or book publishers and get them Bibles. And I think it's a little looser in the state of Texas, because I know our own church, of course, we've got both a Hispanic ministry and an English ministry. We're able to provide a lot of benefits. But if nothing else, your book just gives us some very concrete steps that individuals can take, that churches can take. And I know that's why you wrote the book, because in some respects you really want us to think through what is happening at our borders. And since so many of the listeners are at a border state, although all over the country people are listening to this, it is just, again, a reminder of how we should be finding Jesus at the border. So I really appreciate you giving us some time today. I appreciate you writing the book, and thank you for your willingness to share some of the experiences you've had as a teacher.
Absolutely. Mr. Anderson, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, we're going to take a break, and then George Barna will be with us. He's got two studies here, one on what percentage of Americans really believe life matters, which is kind of interesting, as well as in the midst of all of COVID protests, violence, where are Americans turning for guidance? So we're going to spend some time looking at the Cultural Research Center and getting some of his perspective. Then I want to give you kind of an update on what is happening right now in terms of, while we talk about COVID, about SARS-CoV-2. It seems like it is a great deal more contagious than we thought because of a mutation. So we'll get into some of that, and as well as some of the other news. And so those are all some topics we'll be addressing today. And for those of you that actually like to take some action, our take action item today is called One Bill, One Subject. About an hour from now, maybe even half an hour from now, we'll get into that. We had a conversation about this the other day with Foster Freeze, in which there is a piece of legislation sponsored in the Senate by Senator Rand Paul and in the House by Andy Biggs. And it's something that some of you occasionally call in and talk about, and that is, why do we have these monstrous bills that cover all sorts of different issues? Why can't we have one bill on one subject? Because even as we talk about this issue of comprehensive immigration reform, how's that been working out for you? Well, we haven't had any comprehensive immigration reform in 34 years. Just do the math here. We had a comprehensive health care reform. How's that working out for you? Not very good either. So maybe we need to have much more targeted, specific bills, and this is what would be actually a requirement of Congress to do. So that will be our action item today. My Viewpoints commentary, of course, is on the national anthem and a variety of other topics. And we'll get into a couple of other topics that we have posted today. We have the articles that George Barna and I will be referring to. And then a little bit later, we'll see if we can get into this very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, The Industry of Untruth, and how many times the people in positions of authority have been wrong, very wrong, and yet unwilling to acknowledge that they don't have all the facts. And part of that has to do with not only the pandemic, but even some of the political issues as well. So we'll talk about all those issues, but let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that point of view is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to start off with our good friend George Barna. A little bit later, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news, and I think you're really going to appreciate some of the various topics we'll be covering over these next 2 hours. George Barna, as you well know, is the professor at Arizona Christian University, president of the Cultural Research Center there. He is also a fellow with the Townsend Institute, author of more than 50 books. And one of the things that we have posted from the Cultural Research Center, a study: what percentage of Americans really believe life matters? We've heard a lot about Black Lives Matter, all lives matters, all sorts of things like that. If you were an evolutionist, you might say, well, no lives matter because we're just like the evolutionary product. But this has been a really remarkable study that George Barna and his group at Cultural Research Center have done. Really kind of shocking on the very low percentage of Americans who believe that life is sacred. So, George Barna, always great to have you on the program.
Oh, thanks, Kerby. It's good to be with you again.
Okay, help us out here. You would think that Christians would believe we're created in the image of God. You would think that even this sort of Christian memory of Christianity that still sort of is found in various sectors of our society would see that life is sacred, but you're not exactly finding that with some of the research. Tell us more, if you might.
Well, it's true. It's one of those things where infrequently I'm surprised after having done this for so long, but some of the data here did surprise me. We've been finding for years that Americans think that people are basically good. In fact, 7 out of 10 Americans say that people are basically good. And one of the little surprises there is that we find that to be as true among people who attend evangelical churches or Pentecostal churches, non-Christian churches, Jewish synagogues, Catholic churches, mainline Protestant churches. The numbers are virtually identical across the board. So the idea that we are sinners in need of a Savior hasn't really penetrated to the idea that that means really that we are not innately good, that we need God to save us essentially from ourselves, from our choices. But then when we also start to ask questions about the value of life, we find some confusion. For instance, we find that almost 6 out of 10 Americans, 56%, will say that, yes, people are made in the image of God, but they're fallen and in need of redemption. All right, well, that number is low, but at least the majority grasp that concept. But then when we ask them about the value, therefore, of human life, what we found is that only 39%, less than 4 out of 10 adults, say that human life is sacred. In fact, we find in total a slightly higher percentage who say that human life has no absolute or intrinsic value.
Amazing.
So, yeah, I mean, it's shocking. And then when we even ask them about a practical application of that, about abortion, and we find that, by and large, people say, well, the Bible is ambiguous on the matter of abortion. You can make a strong argument either way. That kind of fits with this notion that life is not necessarily sacred, that it has no intrinsic value, but it's a sad commentary on the collapse of Christianity in America. And, it's one of the reasons why I would say that really in our country today we've got a very serious spiritual deficiency, a profound spiritual deficiency that's producing this worldview crisis, which in turn is responsible for America's cultural demise.
Incredible. Let me just mention that one of the things we always do is have a link so that you can find all of this information at the Cultural Research Center, and you can find that on the website right now. And it's kind of instructive, George, as you well know, to dig in a little bit more because, for example, life is what you make it, but it has no absolute value, 37%. Then I love this one. Life does not attain its full value until we reach our highest point of evolution and expression, 11%. I've been thinking about doing a commentary which had the title No Life Matters, because if indeed you accept the idea of evolution, then really no life is valuable. And there are a good number of people, as illustrated by your survey, that actually do hold to that. Most of the time, evolutionists may say that life is meaningless and that we're just an evolutionary product, but they don't live that way. But here you still find a percentage of people that actually wanted to say that we really don't have any value until we reach our highest point of evolution, which is just amazing to me.
Well, it is. And, when you think about the implications of this, Kerby, a lot of it goes to a broader worldview that basically gives us an excuse to do anything we want to do. Life is meaningless. There is no right or wrong. There is no absolute moral truth. Your life is what you make it. Basically, it's a free slate to say, yeah, do whatever you want. None of it really matters, which in the eyes of a loving and compassionate God, but one who specifically gave us the Bible as guidelines for how to live an appropriate, meaningful, significant, impactful life, that's a total conflict with his view of life for us.
Yes. Again, 1 out of 8 claim that people are simply material substance or biological machines. Another 1/8 argue that people are part of a mind of the universe, which is kind of the new age. So there's just a way you can kind of dig into this. And as an individual that has certainly helped pastors over the years address these issues, and of course you've pastored churches as well, I think this particular research that you've done on this one, we'll get to a different one after the break, could be very useful for a pastor addressing issues like the sanctity of human life, the issue of race and racial reconciliation. And so you've, in a sense, provided some great fodder for sermons and Bible studies, haven't you?
Well, I'm hoping so. And, an easy launching point for that is to talk about something that 7 out of 10 people, regardless of what church we're talking about, embrace. And that's that people are basically good. So if you launch with that and then you dig into some of these other deeper perspectives about why God created humanity, how he created us, did he create us? I mean, even going back to some real foundations, some very basic stuff, one of the things that this research overall is showing is that we may assume that there's a national memory of spiritual truth and biblical teaching that people possess. But in point of fact, if we did have that in the past, we do not have that today.
Well said. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into another issue with the 6th installment of the American Worldview Inventory. Was in the midst of some of the anxiety about COVID and protests and violence and things like that, where are Americans turning for guidance? And so we've got some great information about that. And if you would like to know, that particular article is posted as well. So we've got a number of things that you can find. And again, you can simply go to the Cultural Research Center and find those. But we've also provided some links so that it makes it a little easier for you to find that. And all of that information is available at our website. We have a link to George Barna's website there at Arizona Christian University. Also have all this information about the Cultural Research Center. And we'll come back and talk about where are people getting their guidance right now when we have the pandemic, the lockdown, the protests, the riots, and much, much more. Just another aspect of something that is being researched right now at the Cultural Research Center. And we'll come back and talk about that with George Barna right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should we play the national anthem before every sporting event in America? We all know the arguments for doing so, but the arguments against are increasing. Even before the protests, we often had sports like hockey and soccer where a majority of the players were from countries other than the U.S. And even the players from America often seem bored and focused instead on the upcoming game. Even now, coaches and owners are considering what they might do if many of their players take a knee or refuse to come out of the locker room until the national anthem is finished. Do they ignore it? Do they find the players? In the midst of this discussion and debate has come another proposal to replace the Star-Spangled Banner with another song. Tulsa Athletics said that they have developed a culture of inclusion and acceptance. Never mind that all Americans can feel inclusion and acceptance by participating in the national anthem, but they decided that they will play Woody Guthrie's song, This Land Is Your Land, at their home games. Perhaps they are unaware that Guthrie had been a vocal supporter of communism. Apparently, Guthrie was aggravated by the Irving Berlin song, God Bless America, especially when the rendition by Kate Smith played endlessly on the radio. He wrote This Land Is Your Land as a critical response. Journalist Kevin Powell has a different suggestion for sports teams. Replace the national anthem with John Lennon's Imagine. After all, it dreams of a world with no countries and no religion and nothing to kill or die for. Once again, the communist theme shows up. Lenin himself described the lyrics as virtually the Communist Manifesto. As you can see from these few examples, the debate about the national anthem has gotten crazy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with George Barna, president of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. And we've already talked a little bit about one of the surveys, which shows that a majority of Americans see humanity as basically good. That's kind of Bible Study 101 here, so that's the first issue. Then, majority of Americans reject the idea that human life is sacred. So I thought I might back up to one installment that came out before that one. It's the 6th installment. It says, amid the crushing anxiety of COVID, protest, and violence, where Americans turning for guidance? And bottom line is, George Barna, they're not turning to the Bible. And so maybe that's part of the problem, because if you actually spend any time in the Bible, you would understand that humanity is not basically good. If you spend any time understanding the fact that we're created in God's image and have value and dignity, you wouldn't reject the idea that human life is sacred. So part of it just goes back to the fact that a lot of people have Bibles in their homes, but apparently they're not reading them.
I think that's absolutely true, Kirby. We look in this other portion of the survey at where people are getting their guidance for moral decisions. One of the things that always blows my mind is that so many people are confused about what morality is, and it's really very simple. It's just being able to distinguish right from wrong. So then the question becomes, well, on what basis do you make those choices? And what the survey is showing is that if this were a sprint to the finish line, we've got a dead heat between people choosing their moral guidance from inside themselves, their own feelings and whatever beliefs they muster. Secondly, we've got trusting other people as their dominant source of moral guidance. And then thirdly, faith sources, predominantly the Bible. But as you say, when we look at how many Americans are looking to the Bible first and foremost for their moral guidance, it's less than 1 out of 4 Americans.
Mm.
And, some people have said to me, well, yeah, but, it's very different if you look at church people. And not as much as you might want to think. When we look at people who attend evangelical and Pentecostal churches, it's about half of them who say the Bible is their primary source of moral guidance. You look at people who attend mainline Protestant churches, it's about 1 out of 4, the national average. You look at people attending Catholic churches, it's about 1 out of 7, just 15%. So really, we've gotten way off course here. And I'm hoping that this pandemic is giving pastors a sense of license now to come back and start teaching the foundations, because clearly we've gotten away from those.
And again, the point you just made in passing, I want to emphasize again. I've got a whole shelf of George Barna books, and I think I could grab The Second Coming of the Church or half a dozen others that all say the same thing, and that is we tend to believe naively that, well, the church is different than the world, and yet you have documented countless times in the past, and I think this one documents it right now, that we're a lot more like the world than we would like to think. But it isn't just the fact that we don't have individuals that are thinking Christianly. They aren't necessarily thinking morally, because one of the arguments here is that a majority of adults no longer embrace the values of honesty, respect for the rule of law, the sanctity of human life, or traditional sexual morality. So you're talking about even inside the church, even individuals who are born-again evangelical Christians who attend church at least 2 out of every 4 Sundays, which is kind of a criterion that we sometimes use, they aren't all that different than the world. And when I find myself in a situation where I can't trust my fellow man to be honest, where lying has become somewhat acceptable, that's a dangerous world that we find ourselves in, isn't it?
It is. And, it goes back partly to this issue of, so what is our standard for determining if we're living appropriately? Is it that I'm better than somebody else? Or is it that I'm living up to the standard that God has given to us in His Word? And what I'm finding is that more and more Christians are looking out at the world and they're saying, wow, it's a mess, but I'm doing better than the mess. Well, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the criteria, because I look at this survey, and one of the things that I've come to learn over the years, Kerby, from doing all this research is that we do what we believe. And so in these surveys, I've now started measuring not just beliefs, but also behavior.
Yes.
And in this particular release, this is where we find that when we gave people different scenarios and asked them, how would you respond, or what kind of advice would you give to somebody in this scenario, we're finding that the advice that's coming from people who are considered to be born-again Christians by virtue of their theology, not self-labeling, by virtue of what church they attend, by virtue of how often they attend a church, their advice is not that much different than the group that we call the skeptics, those who say there is no God, there may be God, we can't know, or I don't really care if there's a God, it has nothing to do with me, which is, by the way, the fastest-growing faith group in America.
Yes.
The differences between Christians and skeptics is decreasing every year that I'm studying these things.
That's amazing. And again, like you said, you've been studying the actions, and they say, well, it'd probably be okay to renege on a small debt to a relative. Maybe it's okay to not necessarily tell the truth all the time. And part of it is that there seems to be more and more inability to even begin to discern what would be morally acceptable and morally unacceptable, or what might even be considered a moral issue in the first place. So it isn't just the behaviors, it's even the categories by which they might make decisions about those behaviors, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's a really critical aspect that you're pointing out, which is that the fastest growing area that we see in all of this is people who, when we pose a situation to them, say, that's not even a moral issue. And so we've taken to redefining things where there is a right or a wrong, a good or a bad, an appropriate or inappropriate. And we're just saying, it feels good to me. I mean, how can it be wrong? And that is now the American way of determining morality. If it feels good, do it.
Let me just mention again that I've done some commentaries on some of the work that George Barna has done on Cultural Research Center, so you can see that in the Viewpoints commentary. You know, these two topics we've been talking about here will show up in one of my commentaries, but if you'd like to get the original source, we, of course, have a link to George Barna and to the Cultural Research Center at our website, pointofview.net. And George, as we link to that there is a way in which if they would like to subscribe and receive these findings in your worldview inventory and future findings, they can sign up. Isn't there a way?
Yeah, there's a little box there that they can click on, and it just asks for the email address, and then every couple of weeks when we put out the latest release, it'll just automatically show up, and hopefully it'll challenge our thinking.
Well, again, George Barna, it's always great to have you on the program, and thank you for this research. It is sobering, somewhat discouraging, but we need to get good facts, and I appreciate the fact that you've been on the forefront of that for decades and decades, and just thank you again for writing so many books, doing this research, and joining us on a regular basis here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's a pleasure.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll open up the phones for any of your comments. Maybe some of the things we've said already are comments that you would like to address, but let me also mention something else, and that is we have a take action item today, and it is one bill, one subject. Now, if you were with us about 2 weeks ago, we were talking about this issue with Foster Freeze, and he has been really promoting this idea. Senator Rand Paul has the legislation in the Senate. Representative Andy Biggs has the legislation in the House. So we've made it very easy for you to contact your two senators and your representative. All you need to do is go to the website, pointofview.net. You should, if you're receiving emails from us, be receiving an email about now that would also give you the link. But otherwise, you can simply go to the website, pointofview.net. For your benefit, we have not only information about this on the Take Action item, but if you click on the button that says See More, we actually have a full article that we've posted called One Bill, One Subject, and it all has to do with this very important issue, and that is that so many times we have Congress trying to cover everything. How's comprehensive immigration reform working for you? We haven't had one of those bills since 1986. How's comprehensive medical and health care reform working for you? Obamacare. Has that been really a good idea? Maybe it would be a lot better if we had more targeted, channeled bills that had just one subject, one topic, and force Congress to actually deal with things in a very specific way. And so this is the what is called the One Bill, One Subject Transparency Act. And it's been introduced both in the House and the Senate. And if you agree with that, and I know many of you do, because from time to time when we open up the phones, some of you said, why can't we have a specific bill rather than all this pork barrel kind of legislation and all sorts of other things that prevent us from really getting to the heart of an issue that needs to be addressed by Congress? So we've made it easy for you to contact your two senators and your representative. So take advantage of that. You may have already received an email. Follow that. If not, go to the website, pointofview.net, and it's in the middle section there on Take Action. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me mention again that one of our take action items is One Bill, One Subject. It is part of the One Bill, One Subject Transparency Act that has been introduced both into the Senate and the House. And I think it would be a very significant corrective. And we spent some time about a week and a half ago with Foster Freeze, who was on the program with us, and talked about how this would be certainly something that needs to happen in Congress. Maybe it's a good way to eliminate some of the log rolling, some of the pork and all the other issues, but most importantly, get Congress focused. Focus is a point that I think Congress needs right now when we have so many very urgent issues in front of us. So again, if you want to express your opinion to your two senators and your representative, we've made it very easy. I've had a number of people tell me over the years, interestingly enough, I never wrote to my member of Congress. I didn't even sometimes know who they were, but you've made it so easy because it pops up those names. I can take whatever you've written or make some modifications on it. I can hit send and boom, it sends it out. And I think that's just really helpful. So this is the action item for today. And again, I want to thank Foster Freeze for recommending that. And also want to thank him because he was one of the people that started our matching fund. About 2 weeks ago, about a week and a half ago, I think it was on a Thursday, he just near the end of the program said, you know what, I'd like to maybe have a match put on the table, do a matching challenge, and up to $50,000. And at first he said till the end of the fiscal year, June 30th. He said, no, let me change that to July 15th, which is kind of tax day. And so some of you have wondered, okay, where are we? Because then the next day we got someone else that gave us another $50,000 match. So we all of a sudden, out of nowhere, had a $100,000 matching fund. And those are actually being taken care of. One in particular already has been taken care of because we are up to, I just heard the other day, $73,000 out of the $100,000. So it means we made a little bit of progress since yesterday. So we're down to still needing about $27,000 between now and next Wednesday. So if you can help us out, that would be greatly appreciated. And all that information is at the website, pointofview.net. You can click on that banner, and that means your gift is doubled. $100 becomes $200, $500 becomes $1,000. And we do have a little bit of a mountain to climb between now and Wednesday, so I hope you can help us out in that regard. Okay, let's get to a couple of key issues. The evidence is becoming more and more somber in this respect, that when we talk about the coronavirus, and we talk about what gives you COVID-19, it does show pretty clearly now in a number of different research studies that the particular virus called SARS-CoV-2 has mutated. And it's mutated to become more contagious, not more deadly. Matter of fact, there's some evidence. I'm reading through some of these here. We have this one in Cell. This one comes from Biospace. A number of others suggesting it might be, but to use the actual term, this is the one from Cell. Recommended only for people that have a science background for sure. But tracking changes of SARS-CoV-2 spike, evidence that the D614G increases infectivity of the COVID-19 virus, which is a technical way of simply saying this. We now recognize that the virus that came out of China has mutated. It may also explain why, for a while, China looked like they'd got a control on this. Now, it's possible that China wasn't telling us the truth, but it's also possible that what now is starting to circulate is a mutated form of this virus. And because of that, the hooks on the virus, which easily kind of broke and would sometimes break off, now are stronger. Now, the way to illustrate this would be to say, if you've ever seen Velcro, you know that you have a fuzzy side, and then you have a side that has some hooks. Imagine if the hook side, when you put them together, the hooks broke and it wouldn't stay. Well, the same kind of idea that if you've ever looked at a coronavirus, one of the reasons they call it a coronavirus because it looks like it has a crown, it has these little hooks on there, and those hooks then lock into maybe the epithelial lining in your lung. But if those break off, less likely for it to actually infect you. But now it does appear that those hooks, if you will, are actually much stronger, and as a result, it makes it easier for them to invade the host cell. How much so? Well, if you go back to this journal article and some of the others, they say that the outer parts of those proteins were less likely to break off. This made the virus approximately 10 times more infectious in the lab experiments. So that suggests that if indeed that holds up, that the virus now may be 10 times more contagious than it was before. So that's how people are writing it up. The technical term is 10 times more infectious, but you can see why this is a source of some concern. And you add that to something else I mentioned just the other day, the fact that there are now more and more scientists arguing that maybe some of this can actually float around in indoors for a lot longer as aerosols. And if that is indeed the case, then it again is not necessarily good news. But we're not here always just to give you good news or happy news. We're trying to give you the truth. And that's one of the things we've learned just in the last couple of days, and I thought I would pass it on to you. While we're talking about the virus, it brings us to one of the articles I've posted. We have the two articles about George Barna's research. We have, of course, one about this idea of a single bill and a single subject. But the other article we've posted is by Victor Davis Hanson. And he talks about an industry of untruth. You know, people aren't telling us the truth all the time. I think you figured that out. That's probably why you're listening to Point of View, because we're just dedicated to telling you the truth. And he starts off by talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, because of his esteemed long service as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, oftentimes would make a pronouncement that was oftentimes seen as the gold standard. It almost seemed like it was something that came from Holy Writ itself. And yet Victor Davis Hanson says that since January, Anthony Fauci has variously advised the nation both that the coronavirus probably was unlikely to cause a major health crisis in the United States, and later that it might kill 240,000 Americans. In January, he praised China for its transparent handling of the coronavirus epidemic. Not much later, he conceded that perhaps they'd done a poor job of that. He has cautioned that the virus both poses low risk and later high risk for Americans. He also said that wearing masks was of little utility. Now he says that they are essential. And then hydroxychloroquine, he huffed, had little utility when studies show that it did, and he's kept mostly silent about this. And the point that Victor Davis Hanson is making is the same one we've heard Kelly Shackelford make, and that is, if you don't know, don't say it so dogmatically. It's okay. We live in a world where not everything's black and white. Sometimes it's gray. Sometimes we don't know. It's a novel virus. We don't know all the facts. So don't say it with such conviction when indeed there may actually not necessarily be enough evidence at that point to make a conclusion. And so then another one that Victor Davis Hanson gets into is we're starting to see spikes in very significant locales. Houston, Minneapolis, certain places in Florida. And these spikes are with young people. And he said, why are there currently spikes in cases among young people in warmer states and those of less population density in late June? No one is certain, but one likely reason is that millions of protesters for nearly a month crammed the nation's cities, suburbs, towns, shouting and screaming without masks, violating social distancing, often without observant hand washing and sanitizing, most often with official exemption or media or political approval. And he's saying, just the fact that we can't say, one of the reasons why I think some of these spikes are happening, especially among young people, is due to the protest. And he says, again, perhaps the real cost of 4 weeks of protesting, rioting, and looting was to undermine the authority of state officials to enforce blatant violations of the quarantine. Obviously, if some can march with impunity in phalanxes of screaming shoulder-to-shoulder protesters, while others are jailed as individuals trying to restart their business, then the state has lost its credibility with people, and they will simply ignore further edicts as they see fit. Now, what adjudicates quarantines are the people's own calibrations of their own particular safety. So when we come back from the break, I want to pick up just a few other points in his very lengthy article that just remind us again that you have individuals sometimes not telling the truth, or not at least explaining why, as he will talk about in just a minute, why that statue needs to go down and that one does not, why that organization needs to change its name by why the other organization with the same kind of name doesn't. And I think the problem is well illustrated by the fact that we are dealing with a number of individuals that are using even some of these conversations, some of these orders, some even the cancel culture for their own political ends. So we'll come back and continue our conversation right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Gail Blair was a nurse at Johns Hopkins, but she walked away from nursing in 1989 and toward an unexpected encounter with the police. A degenerative condition that causes gradual vision loss drove Gail away from nursing. At just 37 years of age, she could no longer see. She and her husband moved to a place just about a block away from Wilcox Park and Westerly Public Library. She learned how to independently navigate the sidewalks that led to and from her home and sit in the park. As passersby strolled past in this 10-acre park, Gail would engage them in conversation, telling them about Jesus and sharing with them a copy of the Gospel of John. In 2019, park authorities accused this 63-year-old blind woman of accosting parkgoers and blamed her for littering when they found copies of the Gospel of John on the ground. They asked the police to ban her from the park under threat of arrest if she were to trespass in the future. Sighted persons are free to cross into the park and have conversations with anyone, but park officials called the police on a blind woman who shared her faith with others. First Liberty and its network attorneys filed a charge of discrimination with the Rhode Island Commission on Human Rights because banning a blind woman from entering a public park simply because she offers people she meets religious material is outrageous and discriminatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Maybe for a few more minutes, and then just next hour, we're going to spend some time with Mark Hancock talking about Trail Life Cookout and some things that you can do in a positive way to help your kids. So we'll be talking about that, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. But at the moment, one of the articles I've posted here is by our friend Victor Davis Hanson, An Industry of Untruth. And he talked about the whole issue of how we relate to the virus and some of the miscommunication and really even the hypocrisy. So then he moves from there to the idea of the riots and racial issues and the rest. And he says there's no logic to statue toppling, name changing, or cultural canceling other than the quest to assert power, to humiliate authorities, and to create crises where they do not exist in order to manufacture a fake state of emergency in service of a political agenda. He says, in some sense, whether any statue's fall is contingent entirely on the lack of resistance. And he says, we know this because the ignorant rioters, he says, and protesters cannot explain why monuments to Ulysses S. Grant, Cervantes, who was a slave himself, black Civil War veterans, does that make any sense, or Abraham Lincoln need to be toppled and destroyed as much as the statue of Robert E. Lee. Then he gets into, really, in a sense, the hypocrisy or the inconsistency. He says we're not told why the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University must be canceled out, and has been, but not why the Wilson Center in Washington should not be, or why the memorial to President Washington is targeted for defacement, but not the hit play Hamilton, who was another founder who at one time owned slaves. And then he, of course, says, and who or what, if any, exactly is going to replace our fallen luminaries, because all have fallen and fall short of the glory of God, so everyone's going to have some flaw. And he said, name the most iconic, Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X or whatever. And the current, if he says, rules of perfection certainly would disqualify them as well. Then he starts talking about the name changes. And this has been kind of interesting because the first one he picks out is one that I've mentioned before because I went to graduate school there, Yale University. Elihu Yale was not just a slave owner, he was a slave trader. The name Yale is so identified with the slave trade, there is really no way that if you're serious about this, that you could not and should not change the name of Yale. But, of course, as he points out, the presidents of places like Princeton or Yale or Stanford or Columbia know that they can't really get away with this, so they just try to focus attention on something else. And of course, there's been a real push, as you well know, to change the names of some of these military bases. And I remember Ann Coulter saying, no one, when they hear the name Fort Hood, thinks of General John Bell Hood. Nobody, when they hear of Fort Bragg, the home of the 82nd Airborne, which is much more famous than General Braxton Bragg. And so, in a sense, this idea of let's just rename all of these things is really just is, again, hypocritical, and it doesn't make a great deal of sense. I've got a commentary coming out next week in which I just simply say, what does George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Winston Churchill, Gandhi, Cervantes, Voltaire, and guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan have in common? Not much, but that's just a small representation of the statues that have either been defaced or pulled down. What about the abolitionist? You have the abolitionist Matthias Baldwin, who was defaced. That statue was defaced in Philadelphia. You have the more recent one I mentioned yesterday of the toppling of the statue of Frederick Douglass, a former slave and an abolitionist. I mean, there's no consistency there at all. And I'm arguing that at a time when there's just irrationality out there in the streets, can at least some of us rational citizens sit down and maybe think through what figures are appropriate or inappropriate in the public square? And it seems to me that I think at least we can all agree that somebody who is consistently engaged in evil acts should not be memorialized. We don't want a statue to we don't want a statue to Adolf Hitler, Don't want a statue to Joseph Stalin or any other individual that engaged in all sorts of evil acts. Although I'm still trying to figure out why this statue of Vladimir Lenin is up there in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood, but that's a question for another day. So we certainly can eliminate those. But then every leader is going to have a fall and a flaw and something. That's just going to be part of that. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But as we've pointed out before, you can look at this beautiful sculpture of Michelangelo's David in Florence, Italy. And it's not up there as a tribute to or an endorsement of his murder of Uriah the Hittite, but just a tribute to David himself. And while we're in the process of tearing down statues, I've got one that if you really want to put it on the list, how about this statue of Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood? That statue's in the place of honor in the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. And frankly, if you are wanting to address the issue of racism, I got an idea. Margaret Sanger, who referred to people as human weeds, reckless breeders, morons, individuals who are spawning human beings who should never have been born, but unleashed this whole eugenics movement. And even to this day, look at these Planned Parenthood clinics that are oftentimes located in minority neighborhoods. So if you want to take down a statue, that one seems like a likely one. But again, it shows you the hypocrisy here. We can't take down a statue of the founder of Planned Parenthood, even though the things that she said are as reprehensible, if not more reprehensible, than some of the things that have been said of other statues or memorials that have been taken down. So this is where we find ourselves today. And so I thought that Victor Davis Hanson did an outstanding job of just pointing out some of the hypocrisy, some of the lies, some of the misdirection that has been used to try to justify one kind of action and not another. He ends it by saying there's one other lie that seems to be running around a great deal, and he said it's the monstrous lie that Joe Biden has no cognitive disabilities. He does was a consensus of 1 of 5 Democrat voters. In other words, at least 20 to 25% sometimes of individuals, self-identified Democratic voters, wonder whether or not something isn't quite right with the individual who is running for the presidency of the United States and will will likely be actually nominated and confirmed at the Democratic National Convention. And of course, then he gives some examples of some of the misspeaking and some of the obvious mental confusion. So we live at a time when people just aren't willing sometimes to tell you the truth. And if there's one thing we've tried to do here at Point of View, even if it hurts our cause, even if it is unpleasant, as I shared just a minute ago with the idea that maybe indeed SARS-CoV-2 is possibly 10 times more contagious than we originally thought because of this mutation, you'd rather hear it and hear the truth than have it all sugar-coated over with all sorts of other kinds of statements being made. So that's what we do here, and if you believe in what we're doing, let me encourage you to go to our website, find some of these articles, and if you can click on that button that says Give Now, we still have a little bit more that we need to clear up before the end of this time that was given to us by Foster Freeze, which is July 15th. So again, we find ourselves today just a little over a week away from the deadline, and I'd love to meet the deadline. I'd love to be able to tell him that we're able to meet all of the requirements that he set forth to us. And so if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate it. You can go to the website, pointofview.net. You can call our pledge line number, which is 800-347-5151. And of course, we still take all those checks and go to the bank with those checks and go to the post office to pick them up. And that's Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Let's take a break. Mark Hancock is with us. He's with Trail Life, and we'll talk a little bit more about this Trail Life Cookout and some things you can do for your kids. All that coming up right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about what I call the boy crisis and what to do about it, because if you have listened to this program any length of time, you know that young boys certainly have a need to have a very good, strong leadership, mentors, role models, and the rest. And what happens when we don't, of course, ends up in the streets and in the courts and a variety of other things. And in the past, oftentimes we'd say the best solutions would be to get them involved in YMCA, maybe Boys Club, maybe the Boy Scouts, maybe even have outreach to your church or whatever. You know as well as I, if you've been listening to this program, what has happened to some of those institutions. It used to be that when I would hear that somebody was an Eagle Scout, I would say, well, I don't need to know another thing about this person because they have actually gone through an outstanding organization known as the Boy Scouts. They have earned all their merit badges, and that's just going to be an outstanding young man. But the Boy Scouts took a real disastrous turn, and so one of the reasons why from time to time you hear us talking about Trail Life USA is I think it is, in a sense, meeting that need that has always been there, but maybe was betrayed by some of the decisions made by those people in leadership at the Boy Scouts. So we want to bring back to the microphone Mark Hancock. He has 2 master's degrees in the area of mental health counseling. He has been involved as a youth and college pastor, associate pastor, and a variety of other things as well. But now he is the chief executive officer of Trail Life USA. And Mark, thank you for once again joining us here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great to be back.
Let's see if we can talk about the most recent event, and that is we promoted on here the Trail Life Cookout. And I just thought that what you did there to try to pull every people around the country together, go in their backyard, have a cookout, have a camp out, whatever it might be, was just a great idea. And whether it's organized by Trail Life USA or just simply done on an initiative basis, I just think this is something we need to do with our kids. Tell us more, if you might.
Well, it's quite a season we've gone through, and as you can imagine, an outdoors organization like Trail Life USA with troops all over the country, that we're a resourceful bunch. And so we figured out how, in spite of the things that are going on with the virus and other things going on in our culture today, that it's still good to get outside. And so we started with our backyard camp out a couple months ago, and we had over 16,000 families across the country, not just Trail Life families, but 16,000 families register and participate in our backyard camp out, and then also our backyard movie and camp out. And then just last weekend, we did our backyard cookout and camp out. We invited people to all over the country to invite somebody who's not like them, maybe someone who's different from them, to their backyard and grill some hamburgers or whatever you like to put on the grill. Because, you know, there's so many things to disagree on today, and it seems like that's kind of how most of our communications are, is talking about what it is we disagree about. But everybody agrees that a good hamburger, well cooked on a grill, is a wonderful thing. And so we encourage people to reach out to people who weren't like them, invite them over, and have a cookout on Friday and Saturday.
I just think it's a great idea, and it seems like you had a pretty good turnout for that. And so whether it's a camp out or a cookout, or maybe even joining one of the troops, as I go to traillifeusa.com, I see the map here in which you have the members, the 830 troops in all 50 states. So first of all, if somebody says, I didn't even know this existed, and I would like to get my son, my grandson, my nephew, whatever involved, there is a way to find a troop if it already exists, but there's also a way to start one. And so talk about what actually takes place there at Trail Life USA.
Well, you're in the right place there on the website at traillifeusa.com. You can find a troop, and if there's not one in your area, you can start a troop. And starting a troop just involves getting 5 adults and a chartering organization, which is typically a church. 99% of our troops are chartered by churches. And we consider our troops to be an outreach of that local church, not just a group that meets in the basement, but actually an extension of that local church. And so churches that are chartering Trail Life troops are seeing growth in the church because they're reaching parts of the community that may not be able to reach in any other way. So if you've got 5 adults who share this vision of pouring into the life of boys and getting them outdoors and helping them to progress in badges and awards and outdoor skills and character, leadership, and adventure opportunities, then you can do that under the covering of your church, and it's a wonderful ministry to bring.
Well, again, this is what we really need, and I've talked about this idea of a boy crisis because we seem to have one. First of all, there are a number of young boys that are growing up without fathers. The fatherless American culture is a sad commentary, but even if they grow up with dad at home, he's maybe home physically, but not in any other sense. And so this is an attempt to try to provide leadership skills, mentoring, and a variety of other things. So talk about kind of what happens when these particular troops get together, and what are some of the things that I think could actually begin to address this issue of what I call a boy crisis.
Well, it's everything that you would expect from outdoor organizations, camping and the hiking and all the outdoor adventure and opportunities. But the big thing that's going on that boys may not be aware of, important work that's being done, is we're a male-focused, Christ-centered, boy-focused environment. And so boys are being surrounded by men who are child safety, youth protection trained, background checked, and trained to lead those boys. And it's in an environment that really caters to the strengths of a boy. Like you said, you call it a boy crisis. We sometimes call it a war on boyhood. It's as if boys are some sort of social disease that need to be eradicated or something, when they're now twice as likely to be special education, 3 times more likely to be ADHD. They've fallen behind girls in every single academic category. Their suicide, drug use rates, crime in boys is multiples of what we're seeing in girls. And, it's like we stopped caring about the strength of boys. So in Trail Life, we're talking about those kind of strengths. We bring back things like risk and competition. Now do it in a safe setting with adults who are understanding what's going on. But boys miss that. They miss that sense of risk and that competition. We've taken all that out of our cultures, even schools that say that they can't play tag anymore because it could be emotionally damaging to boys who don't win. And we just think that that's tragic for boys. Boys are inspired by competition. And because we've taken all this real-world competition out of their lives, we've driven them to a virtual world, and they're competing on video games because they can win, they can get points, they can get levels, they can do better than other people, and then we're punishing them for going in this environment where they really excel. So boys seem to get the short end of the stick either way. So in Trail Life, we're bringing back risk and competition in a male-focused environment that helps boys to grow in terms of character and leadership opportunities.
And again, turning to the virtual worlds of video games, digital media, internet, all of that. Too much time in front of a screen, too little time outside, too little time actually being able to do the things that are going to help them develop biblically masculine ideas and values. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Perhaps you have some comments or questions about, or maybe even observations about what you've seen with with your boys or your grandsons or granddaughters or anything. We'd love to give your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Mark Hancock will be with us a little bit longer, and we've been talking about Trail Life USA. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know some more, it's on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should we play the national anthem before every sporting event in America? We all know the arguments for doing so, but the arguments against are increasing. Even before the protests, we often had sports like hockey and soccer where a majority of the players were from countries other than the U.S. And even the players from America often seem bored and focused instead on the upcoming game. Even now, coaches and owners are considering what they might do if many of their players take a knee or refuse to come out of the locker room until the national anthem is finished. Do they ignore it? Do they find the players? In the midst of this discussion and debate has come another proposal to replace the Star-Spangled Banner with another song. Tulsa Athletics said that they have developed a culture of inclusion and acceptance. Never mind that all Americans can feel inclusion and acceptance by participating in the national anthem, but they decided that they will play Woody Guthrie's song, This Land Is Your Land, at their home games. Perhaps they are unaware that Guthrie had been a vocal supporter of communism. Apparently, Guthrie was aggravated by the Irving Berlin song, God Bless America, especially when the rendition by Kate Smith played endlessly on the radio. He wrote This Land Is Your Land as a critical response. Journalist Kevin Powell has a different suggestion for sports teams. Replace the national anthem with John Lennon's Imagine. After all, it dreams of a world with no countries and no religion and nothing to kill or die for. Once again, the communist theme shows up. Lenin himself described the lyrics as virtually the Communist Manifesto. As you can see from these few examples, the debate about the national anthem has gotten crazy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Mark Hancock with us today, and we're talking about Trail Life USA for a few more minutes, and we'll get into some other issues in the news. But if you go to the website, you'll see a very good endorsement from the Benham brothers. They've been on the program with us before. We think Trail Life USA is a great way for boys and dads, and boys without dads, to connect with God in outdoor adventure and grow in character and leadership. And Mark, one of the things that I always love doing is speaking on Christian camps. Not doing a whole lot of it this year. Word of Life has canceled on me. Camp of the Woods has, but nevertheless, that's just because of COVID-19. But there is something very unique about bringing individuals, especially young boys, but families, out into God's creation, because when you mix God's Word in His Bible with God's world in the creation, there are some things that happen in those environments that seemingly happen nowhere else. What have you found?
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful thought, and it is. He does talk to us about finding us in His creation, and so we think that the outdoors is just a great place to be when we're building character and pointing boys to God's creation and how it is He moves in His life and His wonderful, His marvelous works that He's done done before us. And it's also an environment that's so little explored today. And when you look at the challenges that we're having today, the outdoors answers so many of them. And if you're concerned about this virus, worst place in the world to be is cooped up somewhere. Get outside.
That's right.
Go take a hike somewhere. Go be outdoors. So we think the outdoors offers an answer. And like you said, God's glory just manifests in that place out there, and it's great opportunities for men and boys to share with each other about God's creation, about His plan for His people, about His redemptive plan. Everything that happens in the outdoors reflects some sort of quality of God, and it's just a great classroom for growing in godly characteristics.
One of the things that your website says is more than ever, boys need a uniquely masculine program where their assertive, audacious, and adventurous nature is celebrated, not sequestered. And this, I think, is another issue, Mark, and that is if you accept, and I do, the idea that a boy learns how to be a man by being around other men. Unfortunately, right now, the way our world is structured is when the young boys go off to school, most of their teachers are female. Even if they're going to Sunday school classes at church, oftentimes most of their teachers are female. And so in a sense, they're obviously trying to figure out what it means to be a man, to learn about masculine ideas. And then, unfortunately, some of the women see the children in a different sort of way. They see the girls who are able to sit there quietly, oftentimes aren't making a lot of crazy noises, aren't wiggling around, and the boys are, and they are seen as the problem. And so it gets back to this idea of sometimes they're being sequestered. And then, even as we pointed out, because of the advent of the internet and video games and social media, they, if you will, retreat into a world that is probably not as helpful for them. So I am just a real fan of anything that you can do in a Christian camp, anything you can do through Trail Life USA, because it gets them out there, gets them kind of developing some of those skills that are going to be very important for the next generation as they become leaders in our society.
Well, you hit on all really important points there, and I know that it's politically incorrect, but we say it, is that boys and girls are different. Biologically, psychologically, in so many ways, they are just different. There's studies in women that boys and girls respond differently. Boys need movement in order to learn. That's why when you reference boys wiggling in class, boys understand that movement is essential for them learning. So when they're fidgeting in a classroom, they know intuitively they've got to be moving, but we call them ADHD, and we diagnose them with something. Girls are more naturally wired for that environment. They can sit still, be quiet, pay attention a lot more easily than boys. Boys are going to challenge leadership in an environment. That's built into us. That's that leadership quality. Where girls will automatically. I'm speaking in broad terms here, but for the most part, girls will accept that authority because of the title. Boys want you to earn that right, and they will frequently challenge authority. And in a classroom, that looks like rebellion. And so boys are being punished for that quality that's important. And then when we look at some of those qualities over the course of time, some of those things are things that made us great, as a country, standing up for what it is you believe, standing against, speaking truth against power. But in a classroom, a lot of times that can be labeled as rebellious or something, and suddenly we're diagnosing boys just for the simple act of being boys. So it is important that we bring back this idea of the classic masculinity that's good for our culture, rather than how we're painting boys with a broad brush with this toxic masculinity. And we've got to realize that there are some bad men, and there are some men who behave inappropriately. But that doesn't mean that every boy has to be painted with a toxic masculinity brush. That masculine nature of a boy is a powerful thing in a culture, as much as the nurturing nature in a woman and in a girl is powerful in our culture. And we've got to respect both of those. We love women. We have nothing against women or girls, but we have a program that's specifically masculine, and we encourage girls to get involved in American Heritage Girls, because that's
right.
Specifically for girls, built for their strengths, recognizes their strengths, is going to grow them into godly women.
Let's talk about how people can get involved, because as you click on traillifeusa.com, there's a section where you can find a troop, and maybe you're already thinking, I'd like to see if this could be something for my son, my grandson, my nephew, whatever. Or if there's not one, to start a troop. There's also a place for people to volunteer, to donate, and a variety of other things. So if somebody says, I really want to help build leadership for the next generation, want to pour into some of these boys, how do they get started?
Well, that's a beautiful thing, is that Trail Life USA speaks to so many passions in our culture. When you have the single mom who's saying that she wants her son to be in a masculine environment, we welcome those boys who are living with a single mom. And we have men in our program who don't have sons in the program, but they feel called to reach back to those fatherless boys and help to mentor them. And so men who don't have sons in the program are welcome to join as leaders. Women who have sons who don't know a father, they're welcome to put that boy in the program. And we have a lot of men who are not part of troops, but they're part of an area team. And they'll do things like put together area events where multiple troops will come, or they'll be part of a team that goes out and helps start new troop organizers, we call them, or direct service advisors that go around and visit different troops and help advise them and give them advice. So whether it's a father who's looking for a way to spend time with his son in a new way, in a level playing field, or whether it's a single mom who's looking for a place for her son, or a man who feels a call to the next generation to disciple and mentor young men who desperately need it, or whether it's a mom who wants to get involved in an organizational sense and help drive some of the business of running a troop. There's a place for everybody in Trail Life USA. So traillifeusa.com, and you start a troop, find a troop, or sign up to be a volunteer.
Okay. Mark, thank you so very much for joining us. And again, I encourage people to find the link. We have it available on our website, pointofview.net. And let's keep in touch and find out some of the next things you're going to be doing. Hopefully we'll get out of this lockdown and we'll all be able to get out there in the great outdoors once again. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. God bless you.
Let's, if we can, just before we take a break, mention a couple of things. First of all, my take action today is one bill, one subject. Now, if you are actually on our email list, I just received an email from myself, actually, support more transparency in Congress. So that means that it actually has gone out. So be looking in your inbox, and we may have a link there. If not, you can simply go to the website, pointofview.net, and the middle section there under take action says one bill, one subject. And that is, of course, the One Bill, One Subject Transparency Act. It was introduced into the Senate by Senator Rand Paul and in the Congress by Representative Andy Biggs. And I think it's about time we tell Congress, just focus a little bit, okay? One bill, one subject. Let's get some action. Let's get some things done. And so, again, this is a way in which you can contact your two United States senators and your representative. We've made it very easy to do so. While you're there, I hope some of you might think about clicking on that button that says Give Now, because, after all, we still have some unmatched money in our matching fund, and that will expire, unfortunately, a week from tomorrow. So we really need to hear from you, and if you can help us out, that would be greatly appreciated there as well. We come back from the break. Let me real quickly just come back to this speech given by President Trump at the whole issue of Mount Rushmore on Friday. There are more and more people saying if there has ever been an example of the media becoming unhinged over a speech that just about any president could and would have given, then this illustrates again that in some respects, we've got a real problem with the way in which the press has been covering not only this president, but even this country. And so we're going to talk about that right after these important messages.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the speech that the president gave at Mount Rushmore on Friday. And the more I've read the speech, the more I'm really amazed at the unhinged reaction from the liberal press. Now, again, they're free to say whatever they want. That's why we encourage a free press, but that doesn't mean we have to necessarily agree with them. And it's a good illustration of what has taken place in terms of the newsrooms of America. We've had a number of individuals either be fired or step down because they were willing to give even an opportunity for the opposite side to present their views on an op-ed page. The ideas of not giving conservatives a chance to speak on the college campus has now become, we're not even going to allow people who love America or believe in American exceptionalism a chance to express that in the public arenas or even on the pages of any newspaper. And yet that's where the robust kind of debate needs to take place. Gary Bauer put it this way. He said, Friday evening, President Trump delivered a stirring, patriotic address at the foot of Mount Rushmore. It was tremendously pro-American speech, hailed the greatness of our nation and 4 presidents honored there. The president also defended our history against the mobs. And here's a couple of things that the president said. I'm going to give you some more in just a minute. He said, for example, we declare that the United States of America is the most just and exceptional nation ever to exist on earth. We are proud of the fact that our country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and we understand that those values have dramatically advanced the cause of peace and justice throughout the world. A little bit later, he said, we believe in equal opportunity, equal justice, equal treatment for citizens of every race, background, religion, creed. Every child of every color, born and unborn, is made in the holy image of God. And then, of course, you can see the reaction from the Associated Press, the New York Times, Washington Post, to mention just a few, the Los Angeles Times, and others. And so I thought I'd move from that piece by Gary Bauer to a piece written by Rich Lowry, in which he says patriotism is becoming white supremacy. Now, first of all, you're never allowed to question the patriotism of another individual. Tucker Carlson really stepped into it last night when he began to say, wait a minute, you people, that is, you that are the leaders of the Democratic Party, especially some of the people in the so-called liberal media, really do hate America. I think it's fair that you hate America. So while I rarely, he says, ever challenge the patriotism of somebody, I really have some questions of how can you be asking people for their vote so that you can run the country that you hate? And, of course, he mentioned something about Senator Tammy Duckworth. And, of course, the back and forth between the two of those. She's saying, walk in my shoes. Of course, she lost her legs. And I think he would have been better if not had her name in there because it just gave her an opening to really focus on her instead of the broader issue because, as Rich Lowry says, here, never before, he says, has a speech extolling the virtues of America and the marvels of nation's heroes played to such poor and completely dishonest reviews. And he points out the fact that you've got all sorts of headlines. Again, I'll read a few of them just to give you a flavor. Associated Press, Trump pushes racial division, flouts virus rules at Rushmore. Really? New York Times, President Trump delivered a dark and divisive speech at Mount Rushmore, leaning into the culture wars and barely mentioning the pandemic. By the way, I love what Gary Bauer said in his piece. If you want to talk about who started the culture wars, it was the other side that basically launched this against people that were pro-life, pro-family, and that's been existing ever since. CNN said on a very different 4th of July holiday when many Americans were wrestling with racist misdeeds in the country and an unrelenting panic and pandemic. This, of course, it goes on to be very critical of the president. But it's really kind of striking to say that if you look at the speech, and whether you want to read it in its entirety or not, you can see that here are just a couple more quotes from the president. And one of those is, he said, our founders launched not only a revolution in government, but a revolution in the pursuit of justice, equality, liberty, and prosperity. He said that all men are created equal and they are enshrined a divine truth that changed the world forever. These immortal words set in motion the unstoppable march of freedom. Goes on to say that Americans believe in equal opportunity, equal justice, equal treatment for citizens of every race, background, religion, and creed. Every child of every color, born and unborn, that really got the New York Times going, is made in the holy image of God. They went on to talk about those who've been attacking this country, because he says those would tear down the principles that propelled the abolition of slavery in America and ultimately around the world, ending in an evil institution that has plagued humanity for thousands and thousands of years. He says our opponents would tear apart the very documents that Martin Luther King used to express his dream and the ideals and the ideas that were the foundation of the movement for civil rights. And then he went through kind of a list, and he says, here's just a roll call of some of the American heroes. We're a country of Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, Frederick Douglass. We're the land of Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody. We're the nation that gave rise to the Wright brothers, the Tuskegee Airmen, Harriet Tubman, Clara Barton, Jesse Owens, George Patton, General George Patton. He says again, the great Louis Armstrong, Alan Shepard, Elvis Presley, and Muhammad Ali. He says, if nothing else, he called for children to be taught once again to see America, as did Reverend Martin Luther King when he said the founders had signed a promissory note to every future generation. In sum, he insisted it is time to plant our flag and protect the greatest of this nation for citizens of every race and every city, every part of this glorious land. And so again, as somebody said, okay, where's the white supremacy here? Where was the word Confederacy, Confederate? Well, that wasn't in the speech, of course. So again, you're not being well served by individuals who actually are in the media taking almost anything that the president has been saying or anything that anybody else has said in honor of this country as anything other than out of bounds and not to be allowed. Then, at one point, President Trump decided to also take on a couple of other issues, because he said in our schools, our newsrooms, even our corporate boardrooms, there's a new far-left fascism that demands absolute allegiance. And again, Rich Lowry says, okay, you can object to the label fascism, which as a general matter is overused in our political debate, or argue that absolute allegiance maybe puts it too strongly. But he says Trump is absolutely right about the illiberal character of the wave of cancellation sweeping our culture. I talked about this last hour, and we can go through the list again, but it's actually just embarrassing to see some of the statues that have been brought down that should actually be a source of great inspiration. The number of people that are saying, well, we need to cancel this name, we need to cancel this word, but no, we'll leave the other ones because they're kind of our friends. And so as a result, it's just getting more and more difficult. So Donald Trump, interesting enough, proposed what he called a national garden of statues of our heroes. And maybe you could say that's gimmicky. Okay, I'll acknowledge that's a possibility. But if nothing else, it's the idea that, okay, let's not tear down so many statues. Let's build a few that really are individuals worth emulating. And the proposed list, by the way, includes Frederick Douglass, just mentioned his name a minute ago, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman. By the way, great movie of Harriet Tubman that came out earlier this year, Booker T. Washington, and a number of others. So whether you think that's a gimmick or not, it was just one more way of simply saying we need some heroes. And as I've shared before, even in my commentary that's coming out next week on statues, I think we can all agree that when you're talking about some leader that has been really just the whole center of evil, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, whoever it might be, obviously we don't want to ever memorialize them in this country or anywhere else. But if you do anything to honor a leader, whether it's in a painting, whether it's in a statue, whether it's in a movie that is produced or whatever, obviously they have flaws. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Some have more flaws than others, but nevertheless, we want to honor them for their achievement, even if some of their flaws might be easy to identify and easy to criticize. Be careful, because after all, if you start identifying flaws in another person, they might start identifying them in you, and that's not such a good idea. And by the way, Americans are a very forgiving nature. You wouldn't know that by what's out in the streets, but most Americans are. They recognize that nobody's perfect, and honoring an individual is something we need to do more of. Back to a conversation we just had with Mark Hancock just a minute ago. We need to have some heroes for our young boys who are going to be young men and leaders in the future. Anyway, that's my commentary on that. We'll take a break and get back to some other issues right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Gail Blair was a nurse at Johns Hopkins, but she walked away from nursing in 1989 and toward an unexpected encounter with the police. A degenerative condition that causes gradual vision loss drove Gail away from nursing. At just 37 years of age, she could no longer see. She and her husband moved to a place just about a block away from Wilcox Park and Westerly Public Library. She learned how to independently navigate the sidewalks that led to and from her home and sit in the park. As passersby strolled past in this 10-acre park, Gail would engage them in conversation, telling them about Jesus and sharing with them a copy of the Gospel of John. In 2019, park authorities accused this 63-year-old blind woman of accosting parkgoers and blamed her for littering when they found copies of the Gospel of John on the ground. They asked the police to ban her from the park under threat of arrest if she were to trespass in the future. Sighted persons are free to cross into the park and have conversations with anyone, but park officials called the police on a blind woman who shared her faith with others. First Liberty and its network attorneys filed a charge of discrimination with the Rhode Island Commission on Human Rights because banning a blind woman from entering a public park simply because she offers people she meets religious material is outrageous and discriminatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes, and I thought I might close by talking about a book that came out a number of years ago by Mark Bauerlein. As a matter of fact, Dr. Mark Bauerlein was on the program. The book was entitled The Dumbest Generation, How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans and Jeopardizes Our Future. Now, when the book came out, he was really taking on two issues simultaneously. First, that the generation that we now would call the millennial generation thought they knew a lot about history and culture, and they knew almost nothing. You look at what is oftentimes referred to the nation's report card and find out how much they know about history and how whether or not they're reading at the 12th grade level when they graduate. Are they doing math at the 12th grade level? And, of course, you've heard me rattle off those statistics, and they are so depressing. And so that was the first point, that they are really the dumbest generation. They don't even know how dumb they are. Number two, they're also dumb because they're not inquisitive. And the argument is that at that time, they were having an over-reliance on the internet and what at that time was considered to be somewhat embryonic social media. I'm holding up my book on, a biblical point of view on social media, in which we talk about some of the issues. We talk about, for example, the research by Nicholas Carr, the book coming out, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. So, of course, there's that issue. But at the time, even Dr. Mark Barreline, who was a professor and wrote the book The Dumbest Generation, acknowledged that you couldn't always hold the students responsible, because if they weren't being taught in the schools, either in high school or college, we should hold maybe the teachers and the professors responsible. But at the same time, the lack of any kind of intellectual curiosity was probably enough. And because he was saying we're entering into this digital age, we began to see young people who no longer wanted to learn anything. I remember when I was growing up, we were just starting to get calculators, and it really didn't affect me, but I could see that it affected younger people who started saying, why should I learn the multiplication tables? Because I've got a calculator. Well, you started having young people starting to say, why should I learn anything about history? I can just Google it. And so, in a sense, that whole issue of the dumbest generation has been even accentuated. And so this column that came out by former member of Congress, Bob Barr, he represented Georgia's 7th District. And, of course, since then, he heads up the Law Enforcement Education Foundation, and he writes for Town Hall and a number of others. He entitled this, The Dumbest Generation Grows Even Dumber. And the point he's making is this, that the assessment by Mark Barreline was maybe premature and even too kind, because he said Barreline correctly identified over-reliance on the internet and social media, still in its infancy, as the primary culprits for millennials losing their ability to think, learn, and even communicate coherently. What his analysis perhaps did not anticipate is the other part of this that I'm going to get to now, the number of adults who have come to encourage, empower, and support these millennials in these efforts. It's almost as if he says government, and especially adults in government, as well as adults in the news media and adults in the academy, are competing with the millennials for the title. And here's a couple of examples he gives. He says, consider, for example, the issue of providing college students with safe spaces. We've talked about this before with Jonathan Haidt in his book that he co-authored called The Coddling of the American Mind. And these safe spaces are supposed to be a place where they can shelter them, those students, from the horrors. This, of course, is some of the phrase used by Bob Barr, I should say, of the people, the ideas, maybe even the principles that these students, these little snowflake students, might consider to be offensive. Now, he says the students may be the ones pushing for these accommodations, but it's the adult college administrators who cave in and make it happen. And we've talked about this before with even college administrators and presidents. So he says, in some respects, the dumbest generation's getting dumber and being less likely to even have a rational thought or debate about the issues, not just because they don't bring much to the table, but because the adults actually are enabling them. It's a good argument. One more example. This goes on for 2 pages, but the other example I'll just use, he says, young protesters in Seattle may occupy a sector of that once respected city. They may scream police brutality and call for the police department to be defunded. Their demands, however, would amount to little were it not for the city's, he says, clueless mayor, Jenny Durkin, who lauded the young occupiers as patriots, or her police chief, he calls her namby-pamby, but anyway, Carmen Best, who decided that barricades which had protected one of the police department's precinct headquarters should be removed as a gesture of trust to the mob. Anyway, this goes on for quite a long period of time in which he again says some of the same things we've said. And what about tearing down statues of musicians like Stevie Ray Vaughan and abolitionists and individuals that were African Americans that actually fought for the Union but are torn down just as easily? Frederick Douglass, a former slave abolitionist, torn down. He gives examples from Lincoln County, Oregon, which decreed that African Americans did not have to wear masks because in some way or another that might perpetuate a racial stereotype. And you can kind of see the point. The point he's making is that in some respects we can acknowledge that in many ways the dumber generation has gotten dumber, and is not just due to their lack of education and their lack of intellectual curiosity, but it's also due to the fact that they've been enabled by adults in many of these situations to actually find themselves being enabled and empowered to do these kinds of ideas. So anyway, we're running out of ideas and time today, but we will certainly pick up some of those ideas tomorrow and certainly all through the week. I might just mention James Herzen was supposed to be with us the other day. I think he's going to be with me on Thursday, the Church of Woke. I think you're really going to want to hear that, and a number of other topics. And then, of course, Friday is our weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford, Lathan Watts will be with us, and Penna Dexter will actually be sitting in tomorrow for some of the programs, so I think you will enjoy that conversation as well. But just before we run out of time, let me mention a couple of things. My Viewpoints commentary today is on the national anthem. Big controversy right now as to whether or not we should play it at sporting events. Some of the arguments for doing so, we know. Many arguments against, including all the protests and the fact that some of those people and the athletes actually standing there aren't even from America anyway, especially when you're talking about things like hockey or soccer or the rest. But more importantly, others have got some great ideas. I know, instead of playing the Star Spangled Banner, we'll play Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land, or another one suggested John Lennon's Imagine. So I address that issue, and if you'd like to read it, maybe pass it on to others, start a conversation, I'm sure it will do so. You will also see that we have our Take Action item up there, one bill, one subject. I would hope that you take the time to contact your 2 United States senators and your member of Congress, and we've made it very easy for you to do so. And while you're there, I hope that you'll also recognize that we still have some remaining need to fill the matching fund, which will expire July 15th, which is a week from tomorrow. So again, I think we're up at, what I heard, 73,000. Yes, so about 27,000 left. And so if you can help us out, even as we go off the air, you might want to give us a call at the pledge line number, 800-347-5151. Go to pointofview.net. Of course, you can write to us at Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. All sorts of great material we've posted today. You might want to get the George Barna material and also a couple of the other articles we've posted by Victor Davis Hanson. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Doug for his help behind the scenes. Steve, thank you as well. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347 5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME, pointofview.net/time, or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.